MXTV, see you there. What's it called?
You've seen him flying in airplanes, crawling rock walls, riding motorcycles, and interviewing every one of your favorite bands. But for this episode of MXTV, you'll get to see a new side of our usual host man, Tim Bisagno. Sit tight as the man of 1,000 hairdos, the fashion priest himself, tells his very own story. Tim Bisagno is the son of a popular Baptist preacher in Texas, and so he spent every Sunday morning as a child at church. But not every Sunday was the same.
Well, I was 10 years old, and it was in the children's service of Houston's First Baptist Church down in the basement. And they were playing Just As I Am during the invitation. And this particular Sunday morning, I had a tie on, which was a little bit unique for the little Timmy B getting ready to walk the aisle. But what made this particular service a little different is that I had heard God call my name during that verse.
400 children were packed into the old sanctuary of Houston's First Baptist Church that day, and the air was thick with anticipation. They were almost free from the service. The pastor signaled for one more verse of Just As I Am, but Tim was experiencing something entirely different than most of the other kids in the room.
Well, my heart was pounding, that's for sure, and I remember all the other kids were just waiting for the idling yellow buses that were outside so they could just jump on it, and everybody was ready to bolt. But man, I had these seemed like I had cinder blocks on my feet, and I had a little kung fu grip on the chair in front of me because I wasn't gonna go, I wasn't gonna move and go down that aisle. But finally I did release that kung fu grip, and those blocks seemed to lift, and I stepped into that long aisle, and it seemed like it was just God and me.
So Tim stepped out. He took the step into the aisle of oblivion. He had never foreseen himself doing this kind of thing, but today was somehow different.
Well, even as a 10-year-old, I think on that morning, I was able to figure out that it really wasn't going to be about what I thought God was. It was really a matter of God was talking to me, and I had to respond. And of course we always have a choice, we have a free will, but it's almost like I had to step into that aisle. And it was at that point my life turned from just being about me to, even as a 10-year-old, I could tell that my life was going to be about God from that point on, and I had to respond.
Tim's life was about to change. Even the walk down the aisle to the front of the church would be different.
I stepped out into that aisle, and I was all by myself, and I walked that long aisle. I got about halfway down the aisle, and I turned around, and I was still just, no one was there. And I thought, wow, I'm really doing it. Just took a couple more feet or so, and I turned around, and there was one or two more kids behind me. I made it all the way down to the front, and I turned around, and there were 5 or 6 kids there standing with me. And I had the awareness to actually look around and almost like just absorb that moment. And I remember thinking, was God going to use my life in the future to somehow lead others to Christ as he seemed to have done that morning?
Tim's childhood was pretty normal, except for being the son of a preacher.
And I guess one of the main things I remember growing up was that I was always a little bit too wild for the church crowd, and I was never quite wild enough for the other crowd. I guess I had any of the ordinary pressures that any ordinary preacher's kid would have when their dad is the pastor of a church with 22,000 people. But you know, when you get 22,000 people in one room, you got 44,000 eyeballs. And I always seem to like be under the microscope of all these people.
If Tim was a little too wild for the church crowd then, it was nothing compared to what would come later. Tim graduated from high school, and his parents told him he could go to whatever college he wanted to.
But if I would go to Baylor, they would pay for it. So, on my way to Baylor, I was just driving my little BMW, and I had the roll top back, and had the sun shining, and it was flickering off my little silver watch, and I was just thinking, man, this is all good. And I just remember feeling very, very appreciative of what I had grown up with, of what I had. I really did. But I also remember feeling this real heaviness of this inherited responsibility that I had to live up to, that I had grown up with.
But responsibility wasn't the only thing Tim was feeling as he drove off to college. He was also feeling freedom.
So in that place, driving to Baylor that particular day, I remember thinking, man, I'm free. I'm really free. And I remembered a definition that I had heard at one time, that freedom was the power to choose. So I thought, I'm free, and on this particular day, I'm going to make a choice to start living for me. Living for me, myself, and I. No more Mr. Nice Guy, basically, that I had so much grown up with. No more Mr. Northwest Academy, the high school that I went to. No more class favorite, Mr. Favorite Senior, Mr. Fellowship of Christian Athletes President, all that kind of stuff. All that, the high school thing was behind me. No more Mr. Nice Guy, basically what I had decided. Houston was 3 hours behind me. First Baptist Church was 3 hours behind me. And I had God in my heart, but I thought, you know, God, He can wait.
So Tim began his experiment. The experiment started with a turn away from the Tim of his childhood and turned into an all-out flight from God.
I was definitely running from God. I believe that I actually had made a conscious decision that day to start doing my own thing. And I don't know if I realized it, but on that particular day I had officially begun my flight from God. And I remember growing up and always listening to this soft voice that was in my heart, and that was God's voice, and doing what it said. And even though my subwoofer was cranking that particular day, you know, I could still hear God's whisper above the noise.
Tim's experiment began to include alcohol and drug use, and moved from experimental to recreational.
Well, I think probably the typical story with any drug use, I was pretty much wanting to change the way that I felt. And the quickest way to change the way I felt was to cover up those feelings. And you know, it takes a little bit to do that at the beginning, then it takes a little bit more to do it later. And so eventually I'd found myself just sort of fooling around with it a little bit into doing it when I really didn't even want to. And then of course that amount didn't work, so I had to do more, and then I did a lot. And then I did a lot, and then I did a whole lot. And I was really just sort of trying to silence out that quiet whisper that was in my heart, and it wouldn't work. I couldn't do it. So I started mixing a lot of the drugs. You know, I sort of started out using a small amount of ecstasy, or X, whatever, and then it was a medium amount, and then it was a lot. And then that wasn't enough. And then I started mixing it with acid, and then I started mixing that with the cocaine, and then there was a whole lot of drinking going on, in the midst of all this. And so those little, you know, 12 to 18-hour journeys on drugs and such turned into 24-hour deals, and then 36 hours, and then 2 days, then 3 days, then 4 days, and that happened a lot. That wasn't just one little time capsule at a time. I would not sleep sometimes for many days and not eat at all, and so I was just really sad. I was a very, 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 very sad person in my life, and what's the drag about the drugs is that you have to take more to cover up those sad feelings when that's not what you were looking for in the first place at all. It's a terrible, vicious cycle. And I sort of started believing what a lot of people believe, and that I believe that that's if we're sort of like left to our own devices, that if we follow our own little special journey of our own little guided self inside, that we're going to somehow find God, and I believed that for a while, but I don't think that's true at all. I think that if we're left up to our own devices, if you could be really honest and look at your heart in that situation, you'll find a God-hating, a sin-loving ego that's on a passionate path to death, not to life and not to God. It's a slavery of self, and that's where I was trapped in, and I couldn't get out. I needed delivered like a baby.
Tim graduated from Baylor University, still struggling with the call to ministry he heard from God. But his drug abuse was becoming unmanageable. Tim moved to Dallas, got a job at the biggest Baptist church there, and simultaneously enrolled in seminary classes.
Even though I was really messed up, at certain times I could really pull off this I'm okay thing. And I got a job at a really big church in Dallas, and I had this double life. And sometimes people talk about living in that gray zone, and I didn't live in the gray zone. I lived in the black and white world. I was hoping that somehow by getting these jobs and getting this education, that this outside structure in my life would somehow manage that inside turmoil, that it would somehow manage that unmanageability that I was definitely experiencing, but it didn't work.
Tim's choices continued turning out badly. Within a year of moving to Dallas, he was using drugs habitually. He quit his job at the church, quit going to seminary classes, and quit trying to lose the habits he'd picked up in college. Tim was beginning to wear out.
It got to be enough is enough. I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. I was very uncomfortable in my own skin, very, very uncomfortable. And even though my physical frame had grown a lot lighter, my heart was definitely had grown a whole lot heavier.
Mission X Television. Music. Message. Mission.
Listen, pay attention, man. Get a little closer and really soak this in, because I got something that's gonna help you.
I bet it's in that place where I give him an all-access pass, permission to tour, to manage, and completely rebrand my heart.
He just wants to be that loving father that he is, to really just wrap you in his arms and say, I'm here, I love you, and I've got this.
Him guiding you, him showing you the next best thing to do, the next right step. Your life is brand new, washed clean, not just polished up, but it's brand new, man, brand new life.
In the beginning of Tim's drug and alcohol abuse, there had been nightclubs letting him in for free. Free valet parking, free drinks at the bar, free drugs. Now all of that had disappeared, along with the crowd. The glamour was gone, and on the inside, Tim's heaviness was growing.
Well, the guilt and the shame had grown so intense and so heavy, and it was such a burden in my heart that I couldn't really operate normally anymore. And I certainly wasn't praying, and I certainly wasn't wanting to hang around people that were walking with God and such. But you know, I started to realize that this guilt and this shame and the heaviness on my heart wasn't just put there by God to just bum me out. It was put there as a way to help me respond. What he was doing is he was, by putting this pressure on my heart, that he was actually saying that he wanted to talk to me, that he actually missed me, that we had not been hanging out like we used to, and that he actually wanted to return to intimacy with me.
Tim felt like his lifestyle was coming to some sort of climax. His thoughts about everything were starting to change. One night, Tim returned home from yet another 3-day, 3-night outing of drug abuse and partying. Everything started to cave in on itself.
Well, I was finally suddenly struck with the realization that one more hit of X, one more line of Coke, one more beer, one more bottle of champagne, that wasn't working, and it hadn't worked. And one more time, I was hit with the realization that it wasn't working anymore. And so I came home at the end of this outing, this 3 or 4 day outing, and I remember looking in the mirror and seeing an old man's face, and it was my own. And I remember hearing a voice as I looked in the mirror, and it said, "You'll be dead in 2 years. Prove them wrong. Party on the way out. Show them that you're free. Go ahead. Prove them wrong." And I made a decision as I looked in the mirror that, yeah, that's what I was going to do. If I was going to be dead in 2 years, I was going to party on the way out.
David knew that he had a gift that would work harder than he ever could. His gift was like knowing and practicing the truth of a short lyric that he wrote about being selected by God, selected to do greater things than he was able.
Even though I had a college degree, I remember thinking as I looked at myself that even though I had a college degree, even though I had gotten a year of my master's and such, at this point in my life, after all that, now I couldn't even talk. I was not born a stutterer, but I stuttered really bad now. And I remember thinking, how in the world was I going to be in the ministry? How in the world was I going to serve God? How in the world was I going to preach like my dad, if now I couldn't even talk? I had the freedom to serve myself, and I had the freedom to self-destruct.
Tim walked out of the bathroom that night a different person, but it didn't last long.
There was 2 or 3 months there where I was left to do nothing but serve myself, and it was horrible. I was out there trying to prove him wrong, like anybody really cared. Well, finally, at the end of that little jaunt, I came to my knees, and I remember coming home once again after a big outing and hitting my knees there really early one morning, and there on the cold wooden floor in Dallas, Texas, and I cried out to God. And I had done this many times before, but he spoke on this particular morning, and I said that I needed him, not for any little category that I could fit him into, or any box that I had pressed him into. I needed God on God's terms, and I needed him for more than a friend. I needed God to be God in my life.
There on the cold wooden floor of his apartment in Dallas, Tim stopped running. His life of fleeing from God was finally over.
When I was there on that floor, crying out to God, I was very open-minded to whatever he had. Whatever he was going to mention, I was really going to try to do it. And in the midst of that place, he reminded me of this man that I had grown up with. So I crawled to the phone and I looked up his number and I called him and he answered on the first ring. And I said, Fred was his name. I go, hey Fred, this is Tim Bisagno. And he goes, hey Tim, how you doing? And I go, not very good, not very good at all. He said, well, what's happening? And I said, well, I think I've got a problem. And he said, well, how long do you think you've had this problem? And I said, about 6 years. And he said something that made a lot of sense to me. He said, Tim, if you think you've had a problem for 6 years, it's probably a problem.
Tim's friend flew into Dallas the next morning and they met for lunch. Tim followed his advice and got some professional counseling.
And a lot of people think, as I maybe thought at the time, that Christian counseling is really just a bunch of brainwashing. But you know what? My brain was really dirty and it needed washing. So I got that help and I went to that counselor, and after a while he suggested that I get into NA, Narcotics Anonymous, and he suggested I get into AA, that he was only going to really be able to take me so far, that I sort of needed some outside help. And thank God that I got it.
This new freedom Tim found as he got off of drugs and alcohol was different than the freedom he felt several years before on his way to college.
And the cool part about the whole deal is I started experiencing freedom, the kind of freedom that God talks about, man. He says that, God says that when He sets us free, we're free indeed. And I started noticing that I found the freedom to be myself. For the first time in my entire life, I'm like 27 and a half, 28 years old at this time, and I was finally starting to be myself. And I think that's a great gift. And so today I like to tell people, don't be afraid to be yourself. Be afraid not to be yourself. That's who God created you to be.
When Tim started being himself, things started to get really interesting. Within a year of rededicating his life there on the floor of his apartment, Tim was a full-time missionary in Amsterdam, Holland.
I think being surprised by God is pretty much an understatement here. I knew it had to be God that called me to Amsterdam. You know, Amsterdam's the drug capital of the world. It's also the headquarters for the Church of Satan. And you know, I was going to be moving there as a missionary. And I think responding to God's voice in that situation is really kind of an underestimated process of hearing from God. I think we spend a lot of money and a lot of time trying to hear from God. Just show me the way. And then when He tells us, we don't do it. But I was going to respond. I laid it all down and I said, God, I'll go anywhere, do anything, be anything, say anything. You tell me and I'm going. Wham! He spoke Amsterdam to me. So I moved there. Within a couple months, I met a friend named Mark Holmes, and we started a rock band. We called ourselves the Friendlies. And we started going into the nightclubs of Amsterdam, Holland. You know, it was a little bit different scene than it was in Houston. When I was going into the clubs in Houston, I was serving myself. And now I was in Amsterdam and I was going into the same type of nightclubs, but I was serving God. And I had truly found freedom. I was really, really, really happy. I was having a great time serving God. You know, now I sort of say, you know, if anybody tries to tell you that serving God is boring, you could guess that they're probably not serving God. Serving God was great.
The Friendlies started out playing in nightclubs and bars in Amsterdam. Then the Friendlies toured through Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. Then through Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, all over Europe, into Asia and South America. The Friendlies played on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. to a crowd of 650,000 people. They also played in Vienna to a crowd of 20. The gigs were always interesting.
Well, as you can imagine, some of the concerts went pretty well and some of them went pretty bad. I mean, we'd have some situations where people be throwing bottles at us, and our drummer got his knee all cut up and definitely got spit at more than a couple hundred times. And at one time the DJ sound guy in the back unplugged the main power strip and we had to, he shut the whole thing down and basically kicked us out. But you know, sometimes that would happen. But man, the times that I really remember are the times where God's power just showed up with a wallop. and people would just sometimes just be frozen in God's presence, and they didn't really know what it was, but we did. And sometimes in the midst of that place, they would respond to God. And we'd always give an invitation. We always had the lyrics of the songs put up in the native tongue wherever we were traveling, and then I would give an invitation through a translator. And you know, some of the people that would come forward would just be weeping, man. Sometimes, you know, you'd have one or two, sometimes a couple hundred.
Mission X and the Friendlies have something that people want, and they respond to the messages Tim speaks. On one tour in Poland, 400 people became Christians at concerts, and thousands more have responded to the television show MXTV. No matter how many people there are, each one is important. Each person is prayed with, sometimes with Tim, sometimes with others.
And so, you know, I'd step down off the stage and get to pray with some of the people, and I would have, you know, explained about the change that had happened to my life sometimes in this little closing part of the concert. And they'd ask me, well, how did that change happen? You know, I want this kind of God you're talking about. And at that point, I would just try to keep it pretty simple, and I would explain to them that when Jesus died for us on the cross, He was offering us a brand new life, that in that process He would die so that we could find new life, and that at that point He was offering us new life, that they were being offered new life, that they could start again, that they could turn to God and never have to look back. So we'd pray, and we'd thank God for this gift that He has given us of this new life. And man, at that point, they would just pray that prayer with me. So I would just ask them to pray like this. You know, a lot of these people had never prayed to God, much less Jesus, God's Son, you know, who was going to start this relationship with them at that very moment, that this journey was going to start now. And I said, pray with me. I said, say, "Dear Jesus." And they would repeat that. I'd say, "Dear Jesus, please step out of heaven and into my heart, and forgive me of the wrong things that I've done against you. I thank you for being God's Son. I thank you for going to the cross and dying for me. And I thank you for rising again from death. I thank you that you are alive. I thank you that you offer me a new life. And I want to spend the rest of my life serving and pleasing you. In Jesus' name, amen."
Tim's life serving God was something more than he could ever have imagined when he sat in children's church so many years before. God was using him to introduce other people to Jesus Christ, and he was praying with them as he had prayed that Sunday morning. After all that he had experienced in college and afterward, this new life was more exciting and more free than the life he had tried to make for himself.
I think one of the greatest gifts of being able to serve God now is to be able to see other people experiencing freedom, and being able to see them not have to go around proving that they're free, because they've been set free by God. And God says that when He sets you free, you're free indeed.
MXTV UK. Music. Message. Mission.
Well, I just think pain without Jesus is hopeless, and with Jesus, there's victory.
I've found the key to deep contentment.
My Saviour's still breathing. I still hashtag it and tweet it.
My passion for MXTV UK is that the hope of Jesus would reach the hearts of this generation. Our ultimate goal is that people would find freedom from their past, peace in their present, and hope for the future.
MXTV UK, a voice for this generation.
Climax.